In the highland valleys of ancient Turkey, a revolution was brewing. While the great civilizations of Mesopotamia and Egypt dominated the ancient world, something new was stirring in the mountains of Central Asia Minor. A warrior people were about to emerge from obscurity to challenge the mightiest empires on earth. Their story begins with the hardest metal known to the ancient world. Deep in the Pontic Mountains, Highland smiths discovered how to extract and work this revolutionary material that could shatter bronze weapons like pottery. The process remained their most guarded secret, a technological advantage that would change the course of history. These superior tools cleared forests faster than anything before them. The new weapons cut through bronze armor as if it were cloth. Most importantly, this metallurgical breakthrough gave those who possessed it overwhelming dominance in battle. The people who would build this empire arrived in Asia Minor during the 20th century BC as part of great migrations from Central Asia. These Indo-European speakers brought horses, wheeled vehicles, and a warrior culture that prized strength above all else. The harsh mountain landscape, with its bitter winters, scorching summers, and unforgiving mountain passes, demanded resilience. Only the strong survived, and the strong learned to dominate. They encountered a land already rich with established civilizations. The local peoples had built impressive cities like Hattusa, protected by massive stone walls and filled with temples to storm gods and fertility goddesses. Their merchants traded silver and timber with distant Assyria, growing wealthy from the commerce flowing between Asia and Europe. In the southeast, Hurrian rulers controlled crucial trade routes, their horse trainers legendary throughout the ancient world. But the newcomers possessed something their enemies lacked: superior weapons and three-man chariot crews. While other armies struggled with two-man chariots, these crews perfected a deadly combination: driver, archer, and shield-bearer working in perfect coordination. They could maintain devastating arrow fire while maneuvering at high speed across rough terrain. The psychological impact shattered enemy formations before the chariots even made contact. Village by village, valley by valley, the Indo-Europeans established dominance. They didn't simply conquer, they absorbed. Local storm gods merged with their own deities. Hurrian horse training techniques enhanced their cavalry tactics. Local metalworking traditions combined with new smithing methods. The result was a fusion culture more powerful than anything that had come before. The first great king to exploit these advantages was Labana. Whether this was his personal name or royal title matters less than what he achieved. From his base at Hattusa, strategically positioned where major trade routes converged, Labana launched campaigns that would transform a collection of highland settlements into the foundation of an empire. His wars began in the early 17th century with modest raids against neighboring settlements. Victory followed victory as the superior weapons proved their devastating effectiveness. Each conquest brought new warriors, new wealth, new territories under central control. Success bred confidence, and what started as local conflict evolved into systematic expansion across Asia Minor. Labana understood that military conquest alone meant nothing without political consolidation. Others kept local rulers who accepted imperial overlordship in exchange for autonomy. The key was ensuring that conquered peoples benefited from inclusion in the expanding state. Trade networks exploded under imperial protection. Merchants could travel safely across territories previously divided between hostile chieftains. The metallurgical monopoly generated enormous profits that funded further expansion while enriching subjects throughout the realm. Cities grew larger and wealthier as commerce flowed through protected routes. Religious policy proved equally crucial. Rather than suppressing local cults, these rulers incorporated foreign deities into an ever-expanding pantheon. The storm god remained supreme, but local weather gods, fertility goddesses, and protective spirits found honored places in official ceremonies. This theological flexibility created emotional bonds between ruler and ruled that force alone could never achieve. The legal system reflected this pragmatic approach to governance. Early Highland law codes combined Indo-European traditions with local precedents, creating flexible frameworks that addressed diverse populations' needs. Unlike the harsh eye for an eye justice common elsewhere, these laws emphasized compensation and restoration. A man who killed another's ox paid multiple animals rather than suffering equivalent punishment. Women enjoyed remarkably high status within this system. They could own property, conduct business, initiate divorce, and serve as priestesses in major temples. Royal women wielded considerable political influence, with queen mothers and chief wives participating in crucial state decisions. This progressive approach contrasted sharply with more restrictive practices in neighboring realms. Hattusa itself embodied the realm's growing power and sophistication. The capital expanded dramatically during Labana's reign, with new residential districts, craft quarters, and administrative buildings spreading beyond the original defensive walls. Ancient local neighborhoods coexisted with newer Indo-European districts, their contrasting architectural styles testament to ongoing cultural fusion. At the city's heart stood the royal citadel, its massive stone blocks fitted with such precision that later generations believed giants had built the walls. Within these fortifications, the great king maintained his court, received foreign ambassadors, and planned campaigns that would extend imperial power far beyond Asia Minor's borders. The administrative apparatus governing this expanding realm grew increasingly sophisticated. Scribes trained in multiple languages recorded laws, treaties, correspondence, and inventories on clay tablets housed in palace archives. The cuneiform writing system, adapted from Mesopotamia, recorded their language for the first time, creating the earliest written form of any Indo-European tongue. This achievement enabled efficient, long-distance communication and preserved legal precedents for future generations. Royal succession followed carefully established procedures designed to prevent civil wars that plagued neighboring realms. The reigning monarch designated his heir during his lifetime, usually his eldest son, but sometimes a brother or nephew if circumstances warranted. The chosen successor underwent intensive training in statecraft, military leadership, and religious duties. Elaborate ceremonies confirmed each new ruler's legitimacy and renewed noble oaths of loyalty. The warrior culture that had carried these people to power evolved into a more complex social system as the state matured. Military service remained the primary path to advancement, but scholarship, craftsmanship, and administrative skill also earned recognition. A professional soldier class formed the military corps, supported by militia levies during major campaigns. International relations gained importance as imperial influence expanded beyond Asia Minor. Diplomatic marriages bound neighboring rulers to Hattusa, while carefully negotiated treaties defined spheres of influence and mutual obligations. These mountain dwellers proved remarkably skillful at this new form of warfare, using negotiation and intimidation to achieve goals that would have required expensive military campaigns. The superior metallurgy remained their decisive advantage. While enemies still depended on bronze weapons and tools, Highland armies carried blades that could slice through enemy equipment like paper. Their farmers cleared forests, and cultivated fields with implements that made their neighbors' bronze tools seem like children's toys. Most crucially, they guarded their metallurgical secrets jealously, ensuring that their technological superiority would endure for centuries. The military innovations extended far beyond superior weapons. Siege warfare reached new levels of sophistication under imperial engineers, who developed portable battering rams and scaling ladders that could reduce enemy fortifications with unprecedented speed. Light infantry, armed with javelins and axes, exploited breakthroughs created by chariot charges. Heavy spearmen provided defensive anchors around which mobile forces could rally. By the mid-17th century, the foundations of future empire were solidly established. The state Labana, built from a single city, now controlled most of Central Asia Minor, commanded the emerging metallurgical trade and projected power far beyond its mountain borders. His successors would inherit not just territory and treasure, but the administrative, military, and diplomatic tools necessary to challenge the greatest powers of their age. The broader ancient world remained unaware of what was stirring in the Anatolian highlands. In Syria's valleys, Egyptian and Mesopotamian armies clashed for control of the world's richest trade routes. Ambitious Babylonian kings dreamed of reviving ancient glory. Northern tribal peoples pressed against civilization's frontiers, seeking opportunities for conquest and plunder. None yet understood that a new power was rising, one that possessed superior technology, battle-tested tactics, flexible institutions, and the geographic advantages of mountain strongholds. These highland warriors had learned to combine multiple cultures' strengths into something greater than the sum of its parts. They stood poised to enter the wider world as equals to any power on earth. The age of expansion was about to begin. From their mountain fortress at Hattusa, ambitious kings would soon launch campaigns that would shake the ancient world to its foundations, challenging Egypt's pharaohs, conquering Babylon itself, and establishing an empire that stretched from the Black Sea to the borders of the Holy Land. The first great explosion of Hittite power was just around the corner. The mountain fortress of Hattusa had never seen anything like it. In the winter of 1650 BC, as snow blanketed the towering peaks, the great ruler stood before his assembled war council and declared his intention to march beyond the traditional boundaries of his realm. Not content with dominating Central Asia Minor, he would lead his forces into the southern lands themselves, challenging powers that had ruled the ancient world for over 1,000 years. What drove this audacious ambition? The answer lay in both opportunity and necessity. To the south, the great powers were locked in deadly rivalry. Egypt's pharaohs battled Mesopotamian rulers for control of wealthy Levantine cities, their forces clashing repeatedly in the fertile valleys between the mountains and the sea. Neither side possessed the technological advantages that made northern forces virtually unstoppable in open battle. The strategic situation was more complex than simple military opportunism. Trade routes that had enriched Hattusa for generations were under constant threat from southern conflicts. Merchant caravans carrying precious metals, luxury goods, and essential commodities faced increasing dangers as warfare spread throughout the region. Tribute from vassal territories had declined as local rulers struggled to maintain their own security. Most critically, intelligence reports suggested that both Egypt and Babylon were considering joint action against the emerging northern threat. The rulers' advisors were divided on the wisdom of southern expansion. Veteran commanders who had fought in the consolidation wars argued for continuing the proven strategy of gradual territorial expansion, absorbing neighboring territories one by one until the entire Anatolian plateau lay under central control. Younger officers, hungry for glory and plunder, advocated for immediate strikes against the wealthy southern cities before they could organize effective resistance. The merchant class presented perhaps the most compelling arguments for intervention. Representatives from trading families that had grown wealthy from commerce with distant lands painted vivid pictures of the riches awaiting in the south. Aleppo's warehouses overflowed with goods from across the known world. Egyptian gold, Mesopotamian textiles, cedar wood from Lebanese mountains, precious stones from distant India, ivory from Africa's mysterious interior. Control of even a few major trading centers would multiply royal revenues beyond anything previously imaginable. The monarch understood that timing was everything. Strike while the southern powers were distracted by each other, seize control of crucial trade routes, and establish dominance before enemies could organize effective resistance. The plan was brilliant in its simplicity and terrifying in its implications. The preparations were methodical and thorough. Throughout the winter months, weaponsmiths worked day and night, forging spearheads, arrow points, and sword blades from the precious metal that remained their greatest strategic asset. Chariot workshops produced hundreds of war vehicles, each equipped with the three-man crews that had proven so devastatingly effective against traditional opponents. Quartermasters stockpiled grain, dried meat, wine, oil, and other supplies necessary for extended campaigns far from home. Intelligence gathering reached new levels of sophistication during these months of preparation. Spies disguised as merchants traveled throughout the Levantine territories, mapping defensive positions, identifying potential allies among discontented local rulers, and assessing the military capabilities of target cities. These agents reported that many settlements had grown complacent during decades of prosperity, their walls poorly maintained, and their garrisons more concerned with ceremonial duties than actual warfare. Religious ceremonies accompanied the material preparations. Priests performed elaborate rituals designed to secure divine favor for the coming campaigns. The storm god received magnificent offerings, gold vessels, precious stones, and the sacrifice of prize bulls, whose blood was sprinkled on weapon caches to ensure victory. Oracles were consulted, omens interpreted, and favorable signs proclaimed to boost morale among the troops. The diplomatic dimension of preparation proved equally crucial. Throughout the winter, envoys traveled to courts across Anatolia, negotiating a series of treaties with neighboring rulers who might threaten the homeland, while the main forces campaigned abroad. Some agreements were sealed with marriages between royal families, others with substantial tribute payments, still others with barely veiled threats of destruction. By spring, the northern and eastern frontiers had been secured, freeing the entire professional force for the southern offensive. The first target was Aleppo, the most powerful city-state in the northern Levant, and the key to controlling regional trade routes. For generations, Aleppo's rulers had grown rich from commerce, flowing between Mesopotamia and the Mediterranean coast. Their merchants traded in luxury goods from across the known world: Egyptian gold, Mesopotamian textiles, cedar wood from the Lebanese mountains, ivory from distant Africa. The city's walls enclosed palaces and temples rivaling those of Babylon itself. The wealth that made Aleppo so attractive also made it vulnerable. Its strength rested on commercial networks rather than force of arms. The city's defenders consisted primarily of bronze-armed infantry, supported by traditional two-man chariots, formidable against bandits or small raiding parties, but inadequate against a full-scale invasion by technologically superior opponents. Aleppo's ruling council had grown complacent during decades of prosperity. Trade agreements and diplomatic marriages had maintained peace with neighboring powers, creating an illusion of permanent security. The city's magnificent walls, built of massive stone blocks and rising over 30 feet above the surrounding plain, had never been seriously tested by determined besiegers. Warehouses bulged with goods awaiting shipment to distant markets, while temple treasuries overflowed with offerings from grateful merchants whose ventures had prospered under divine protection. The invasion began in the spring of 1650 with a speed and violence that caught the entire region off guard. Northern forces swept down from the mountain passes like an avalanche, overwhelming frontier garrisons before they could send warnings to the major cities. The psychological impact was immediate and devastating. For centuries, the Levantine territories had known relative peace under local rulers who commanded respect throughout the region. Now foreign warriors with strange gods and incomprehensible weapons were carving through defenses as if they were made of paper. Advanced units reached Aleppo's outskirts within 10 days of crossing the mountain passes. The city's defenders had barely enough time to close the gates and man the walls before enemy forces began surrounding their position. What followed was a siege that would revolutionize warfare throughout the ancient world and establish new standards for military engineering and tactical innovation. The siege of Aleppo became a masterclass in innovation and brutality. Northern engineers deployed massive battering rams constructed from entire tree trunks sheathed in metal plates, hauled forward on wheels and operated by teams of dozens of men. These weapons pulverized gates designed to withstand traditional Bronze Age warfare. Scaling ladders tall enough to overtop the city's impressive walls enabled assault troops to overwhelm defensive positions faster than guards could respond. Most devastating of all, coordinated chariot charges broke the morale of defending forces who had never faced such concentrated mobile firepower. The attackers employed psychological warfare with calculated precision. During the initial days of the siege, captured defenders were executed in full view of the walls, their heads mounted on spikes as warnings to those still resisting. Night attacks using fire arrows set portions of the city ablaze, creating panic among civilians who had never experienced warfare. Drums thundered continuously from the besieging camps, preventing sleep and gradually wearing down both military and civilian morale. Engineering innovations went far beyond simple siege equipment. Miners began tunneling beneath the walls, placing wooden supports that could be burned to collapse entire sections of fortification. Archers positioned in mobile towers could shoot down into the city, picking off defenders and creating constant fear among the population. Most ingeniously, water supplies were cut by diverting streams that fed the city's cisterns, creating thirst that affected everyone from the royal palace to the humblest workshop. The siege stretched through the summer months as Aleppo's rulers desperately sought relief from their traditional allies. Envoys slipped out through secret passages, carrying appeals for assistance to Egyptian garrisons in the south and Mesopotamian forces in the east. But distance and the speed of the northern advance had left the city isolated. No help was coming. Inside the walls, conditions deteriorated steadily. Food supplies dwindled as the siege continued. Tensions rose between different quarters of the city as rumors spread about secret negotiations with the attackers. The merchant class, whose wealth depended on trade networks now completely disrupted, began pressuring the ruling council to seek terms. Priests declared that the gods had abandoned the city due to some unknown transgression, adding religious despair to material hardship. When Aleppo's walls finally collapsed after a 3-month siege, the conqueror faced a crucial decision that would define the character of his expanding dominion. Previous conquerors had typically sacked captured cities, carrying off treasure and slaves before withdrawing to their homelands. But the northern ruler had grander ambitions. He intended to stay, to rule, to build something lasting from his conquests. The fall of Aleppo sent shockwaves throughout the ancient Near East. For the first time in recorded history, a power from the northern mountains had successfully challenged the established order in the Levantine heartland. Egyptian scribes recorded their pharaoh's alarm at reports of these mysterious warriors. Babylonian merchants fled northward, abandoning trade routes they had traveled for generations. Diplomatic correspondence from the period reveals growing panic among rulers who suddenly realized that their world was changing in ways they could neither predict nor control. The northern commander exploited this psychological advantage with ruthless calculation. City after city surrendered without resistance rather than face Aleppo's fate. Those who submitted early received relatively generous terms. Local autonomy under new oversight, protection of traditional religious practices, continuation of established trade relationships. Those who resisted faced systematic destruction that became legendary throughout the region. But the true innovation lay not in the conquest itself, but in what followed. Instead of simply looting and withdrawing, the Northerners established a sophisticated administrative system designed to transform temporary victory into permanent control. Conquered territories were organized into provinces governed by appointed officials who combined local knowledge with loyalty to the central authority. Syrian nobles who accepted the new order found places in this system, their skills and connections valued by rulers who understood the complexities of governing diverse populations. The wealth flowing from these conquests transformed northern society itself. Levantine tribute included not just gold and silver, but skilled craftsmen, scholars, and administrators whose expertise enhanced state capabilities. Architects familiar with southern building techniques introduced new styles of construction to the capital. Scribes who understood multiple languages expanded the bureaucratic apparatus. Artists brought new aesthetic traditions that enriched court culture. Trade networks expanded exponentially as merchants gained access to routes previously controlled by hostile powers. Caravans carrying goods from India and Central Asia could now travel safely from the Mediterranean coast to the Black Sea. The capital at Hattusa grew larger and more magnificent, its palaces and temples reflecting the cosmopolitan character of the expanding state. New quarters housed foreign artisans, diplomatic residences accommodated visiting ambassadors, and expanded markets sold goods from across the known world. The revenue streams generated by this commercial expansion funded further growth. Tribute from conquered cities provided steady income, but the real wealth came from taxes on trade. Customs duties, port fees, and market taxes generated resources that earlier rulers could never have imagined. These funds supported larger professional forces, more sophisticated administrative systems, and monumental building projects that advertised state power throughout the region. Religious policy proved particularly crucial to long-term stability. Rather than imposing highland beliefs on conquered peoples, imperial administrators incorporated Syrian deities into the expanding royal pantheon. The storm god remained supreme, but local weather gods, fertility goddesses, and protective spirits received official recognition and support. Temples were rebuilt rather than destroyed. Priests retained their positions, and traditional festivals continued under imperial sponsorship. The wealth flowing from these conquests transformed highland society itself. Syrian tribute included not just gold and silver, but skilled craftsmen, scholars, and administrators whose expertise enhanced imperial capabilities. Trade networks expanded dramatically, as merchants gained access to routes previously controlled by hostile powers. The capital at Hattusa grew larger and more magnificent, its palaces and temples reflecting the cosmopolitan character of the expanding empire. But success bred its own problems. The more territory Hattusili conquered, the more enemies he created. Egyptian pharaohs watched the highland expansion with growing alarm, recognizing a fundamental threat to their traditional dominance in the region. Mesopotamian kings began forming defensive alliances against the northern upstarts. Most dangerously, success attracted the attention of powers that had previously ignored the highland realm as irrelevant to their strategic calculations. The king's response was characteristically aggressive. Rather than consolidating his gains and seeking accommodation with threatened neighbors, he launched new campaigns designed to eliminate potential enemies before they could organize effective resistance. Highland armies struck deeper into Syria, capturing cities that controlled approaches to both Egypt and Mesopotamia. These expanded operations required increasingly sophisticated logistical support. Supply lines stretched across hundreds of miles of potentially hostile territory. Garrison forces had to be maintained in dozens of conquered cities. Local administrators needed protection from rebels and brigands who operated from mountain strongholds throughout the region. The strain on highland resources was enormous. Military service removed thousands of men from agricultural and craft production. Tribute from conquered territories helped offset these costs, but maintaining imperial control required constant vigilance and frequent military intervention. Any sign of weakness invited rebellion. Any reduction in military pressure encouraged enemies to test imperial resolve. Hattusili's solution was to institutionalize warfare as a permanent feature of imperial administration. Professional military units were stationed throughout the empire, ready to respond immediately to threats or opportunities. Local militias provided additional manpower during major campaigns. Most importantly, the king established a system of military colonies where veteran soldiers received land grants in exchange for permanent garrison duty. This transformation of northern society had profound consequences that extended far beyond simple administrative efficiency. Traditional tribal structures gave way to more hierarchical organizations centered on service to the state. Social advancement increasingly depended on battlefield achievement rather than birth or inherited wealth. The warrior ethos that had originally carried these people to power became even more dominant as territorial expansion continued year after year. The legal system evolved rapidly to address the complexities of governing diverse populations across vast territories. State law codes balanced traditional northern customs with practical necessities of ruling conquered peoples. Local legal traditions continued operating alongside central courts, creating a flexible system that could adapt to different cultural contexts while maintaining overall coherence. Judges traveled circuit routes, hearing appeals, and ensuring consistent application of justice throughout the realm. Perhaps most remarkably, women's roles within this increasingly organized society remained progressive compared to contemporary civilizations. Royal women continued wielding significant political influence, often serving as regents for young rulers or governors of important provinces. Service was primarily male, but women controlled much of the economic activity that supported territorial expansion, managing agricultural estates, directing craft production, organizing trade networks that connected distant regions. The diplomatic revolution that accompanied territorial expansion proved as important as the conquests themselves. Traditional approaches to international relations had been based on mutual respect between established powers of roughly equal strength. The emergence of a new force capable of projecting power across such vast distances forced a complete reconsideration of diplomatic practice throughout the ancient world. Marriage alliances, the traditional foundation of international relations, took on new complexity when one partner possessed overwhelming strength. Northern princesses married into local ruling families throughout the Levant, creating networks of kinship that bound regional elites to the central court. These relationships provided intelligence, local support during crises, and emotional connections that transcended mere political calculation. Tribute relationships replaced traditional trade agreements in many areas, fundamentally altering economic relationships throughout the region. Cities that had previously negotiated as equals now sent annual payments to the northern capital in exchange for protection and commercial privileges. These arrangements generated enormous revenues, while creating vested interests in stability among local merchant classes. The transformation extended to religious practices in ways that would influence spiritual development throughout the ancient Near East. Temple cults that had previously served purely local functions began incorporating elements from the northern pantheon. Priestly exchanges brought foreign theological concepts to traditional religious centers. Most significantly, the concept of a supreme storm god ruling over multiple regional deities provided a model for later monotheistic developments. By 1620, 30 years after beginning the southern campaigns, the ruler had fundamentally altered the balance of power throughout the ancient Near East. The state stretched from the central mountains to the approaches of Egypt, from the Mediterranean coast to the borders of Mesopotamia. Northern forces had proven their superiority in battle after battle. Administration had demonstrated its effectiveness in governing diverse populations, and diplomacy had created networks of alliance and tribute that projected power. Transformation. The monarch was aging, and the question of succession loomed increasingly large. Territorial expansion had been driven by personal charisma and genius for war. Could successors maintain the momentum of conquest, or would the state fragment under less capable leadership? The answer came in 1590, when the great conqueror died after a brief illness, leaving the throne to his grandson, Mursili I. The young monarch inherited not just territory and treasure, but enormous challenges that would test every aspect of state strength. Enemies who had been cowed by his grandfather's reputation sensed opportunity in the succession of an untested ruler. Rebellions erupted in multiple provinces simultaneously. Egyptian forces probed the southern frontiers. Mesopotamian diplomats sought to detach Levantine cities from northern control through offers of alliance and trade privileges. The new ruler's position was complicated by internal court politics that had simmered beneath the surface during the previous reign. Different factions supported different approaches to governing the expanded realm. Conservative nobles advocated consolidation, securing existing territories and establishing stable administrative systems before attempting further expansion. Younger commanders, many of whom had built their careers during the conquest period, argued for continued aggression to maintain the momentum that had carried the state to greatness. The economic dimension of these debates reflected fundamental questions about the nature of power itself. Tribute from conquered territories provided immediate wealth, but required constant oversight and occasional intervention to maintain. Trade revenues offered more sustainable income, but depended on peaceful relationships with partners who might be tempted to seek independence. The balance between coercion and cooperation would determine not just the state's future prosperity, but its very survival. Religious considerations added another layer of complexity to the succession crisis. Priests who had overseen the integration of foreign deities into the royal pantheon worried that political instability might undermine the theological foundations of rule. Local cults throughout the realm watched carefully for signs of weakness that might allow them to reassert independence. Most critically, the legitimacy of divine kingship itself was at stake. If the gods truly favored the northern dynasty, why had they allowed the great conqueror to die at such a crucial moment? Mursili's response would determine whether the state his grandfather built would survive and prosper or collapse into the chaos that had claimed so many previous conquerors. The young monarch faced the ultimate test of northern power. Could a civilization built on conquest successfully transfer authority from one generation to the next? His answer came in the form of the most audacious campaign in ancient history, a strike that would carry northern forces further from home than any previous expedition and establish their reputation as the most formidable warriors of their age. Rather than consolidating existing territories or seeking accommodation with threatened neighbors, Mursili chose to demonstrate state power through an act so bold that it would shock the entire ancient world. The target was Babylon itself, the greatest city of Mesopotamia, heir to thousands of years of civilization, center of learning and culture that had given the world its first laws and literature. No foreign army had successfully captured Babylon for over 4 centuries. Its massive walls, complex defenses, and strategic location had made it virtually impregnable. Its wealth was legendary, its population enormous, its symbolic importance incalculable. Yet this was precisely what made Babylon the perfect target for a young ruler who needed to establish his credentials as a worthy successor to his grandfather's legacy. Success would demonstrate that the northern state remained as dangerous as ever. Failure would invite rebellions throughout the realm and possibly lead to complete collapse. The campaign would test every innovation that had made northern expansion possible. Superior metallurgy, advanced tactics, sophisticated logistics, diplomatic skill, and the administrative capacity to coordinate complex operations across vast distances. It would also reveal whether the cultural fusion that had strengthened the state during its rise could survive the ultimate test of ambition. The stage was set for the most dramatic chapter in northern expansion, a campaign that would either establish permanent dominance or destroy everything the previous generation had built. The young ruler's decision would echo through centuries of ancient history, marking either the triumph or the catastrophic failure of northern ambitions. The fate of the ancient world hung in the balance. The young ruler stood at the crossroads of history. In the spring of 1595 BC, as reports of rebellions poured in from across his grandfather's conquered territories, Mursili I made a decision that would define not just his own reign, but the entire future of his people. Rather than rushing to suppress local uprisings or negotiating with threatening neighbors, he would undertake the most audacious campaign in recorded history, a lightning strike against the great Mesopotamian capital itself. The very idea seemed impossible. The legendary city lay over 500 miles from the highland capital, across deserts, rivers, and territories controlled by hostile powers. This ancient metropolis had stood unconquered for 4 centuries, its massive walls and complex defenses making it the most formidable fortress in the ancient world. Its population numbered in the hundreds of thousands. Its wealth was legendary, and its symbolic importance as the heir to Mesopotamian civilization made it seem divinely protected. Yet this was precisely why the Mesopotamian capital represented the perfect target for a young monarch who needed to establish his credentials as a worthy successor to his grandfather's legacy. Previous rulers throughout history had built their reputations through gradual territorial expansion or defensive victories against invading forces. Mursili would announce his arrival on the world stage by accomplishing something no foreign power had achieved in living memory. The strategic calculation behind this seemingly reckless decision revealed sophisticated understanding of both tactical capabilities and political psychology. News of a successful assault on the ancient metropolis would instantly crush rebellious movements throughout the Highland territories. Local rulers who might be tempted to declare independence would think twice about challenging a power capable of such unprecedented achievements. Most importantly, success would demonstrate that the technological and tactical advantages that had carried the mountain state to greatness remained as decisive as ever. Preparation for this bold venture required months of careful planning that tested every aspect of state organization. The logistics alone were staggering. Moving a large enough force to threaten the Mesopotamian capital across such vast distances demanded unprecedented coordination of supplies, transportation, and communication. Traditional approaches to campaign planning were completely inadequate for an operation of this scale and ambition. The combat innovations developed during the Levantine conquests were refined and perfected for this ultimate test. Chariot forces received new vehicles specifically designed for long-distance operations, with reinforced wheels, improved suspension systems, and modular construction that allowed for field repairs using standardized components. Infantry equipment was standardized to simplify supply requirements, with each soldier carrying identical weapons, armor, and tools that could be maintained and replaced more easily during extended campaigns. Perhaps most critically, this great raid would test the iron monopoly that remained the foundation of Highland tactical superiority. Weapons and tools manufactured from the precious metal gave individual soldiers decisive advantages over bronze-equipped opponents. But the real strategic value lay in the psychological impact of technological superiority. Enemy forces facing iron-armed opponents knew before battle began that their equipment was fundamentally inferior, a realization that often determined the outcome before fighting even commenced. Intelligence gathering for the ambitious operation reached new levels of sophistication that would influence espionage techniques for centuries to come. Agents disguised as merchants, pilgrims, and diplomats had been infiltrating Mesopotamian territories for months, mapping defensive positions, assessing garrison strengths, and identifying potential allies among discontented local populations. These operatives reported that the target city's current ruler, Samsu-Ditana, commanded limited popular support and faced growing economic difficulties that might create opportunities for foreign intervention. The diplomatic dimension of preparation proved equally crucial to the expedition's success. Secret negotiations with tribal leaders along the planned route secured passage rights and supply agreements that would enable the northern forces to maintain their advance without exhausting their own logistics. Some agreements were sealed with gold, others with promises of future trade relationships, still others with threats of destruction for those who might consider opposing the passage. Religious ceremonies accompanied the material preparations, with elaborate rituals designed to secure divine favor for this unprecedented undertaking. The storm god received magnificent offerings, golden vessels, precious stones, and the sacrifice of prize bulls whose blood was sprinkled on weapon caches to ensure victory. Priests proclaimed favorable omens and divine signs that encouraged troops who would be marching further from home than any Highland force in history. The great venture departed Hattusa in the late summer of 1595. timing calculated to arrive at the target during the most favorable season for siege operations. The force itself represented the cream of Highland combat capability, veteran chariot crews who had proven themselves in the Levantine campaigns, elite infantry units equipped with the finest iron weapons, and specialist engineers who had perfected the siege techniques that had conquered cities throughout the region. The advance toward the Mesopotamian capital demonstrated coordination and speed that astonished contemporary observers. Rather than following traditional caravan routes that could be easily monitored and blocked, the Highland forces struck across country using intelligence gathered during months of careful reconnaissance. Cities that might have organized resistance found themselves bypassed entirely, while those foolish enough to attempt interference were overwhelmed so quickly that warnings could not be sent ahead. The psychological impact of this lightning advance created panic throughout Mesopotamia. For generations, the region had enjoyed relative security behind the barrier of distance and difficult terrain that separated the civilized south from the barbarian highlands. The sudden appearance of a large, well-equipped foreign force, moving with such speed and purpose, shattered assumptions about natural defensive barriers and tactical possibilities. Local rulers faced impossible choices as reports arrived of the approaching northern expedition. Those who attempted resistance were crushed with devastating efficiency, their cities sacked, and their populations deported or massacred as examples to others. Those who offered submission were generally spared immediate destruction, but found themselves incorporated into the advancing force as guides, suppliers, or auxiliary troops, whether they wanted such roles or not. The speed of the advance created its own momentum that carried the expedition forward almost regardless of strategic considerations. Cities that might have organized effective resistance if given time to prepare found themselves confronted by overwhelming force before adequate preparations could be completed. Defensive alliances that might have created serious obstacles were disrupted before they could coordinate their efforts effectively. Word of the approaching crisis reached the great city weeks before the Highland forces appeared on the horizon, but its rulers found themselves paralyzed by the unprecedented nature of the threat. Traditional diplomatic approaches were useless against invaders who showed no interest in negotiation or accommodation. Defense preparations were hampered by uncertainty about enemy capabilities and intentions. Most critically, the psychological shock of facing the impossible left many leaders unable to respond effectively to the rapidly developing situation. The siege that followed became a legend that would be retold for centuries throughout the ancient world. Highland engineers deployed every innovation developed during previous campaigns, plus new techniques specifically designed to overcome the target's formidable defenses. Massive siege towers enabled attackers to fight on equal terms, with defenders manning the city's towering walls. Battering rams, reinforced with iron fittings, smashed through gates that had protected the metropolis for generations. The defenders fought with desperate courage, knowing that defeat meant not just personal destruction, but the end of their entire way of life. The ancient metropolis's walls had never been breached by foreign enemies. Its temples housed treasures accumulated over millennia of Mesopotamian civilization. Its libraries contained the world's greatest collection of literature, law, and learning. Everything that defined Mesopotamian culture was at stake in this unprecedented confrontation. But courage alone could not overcome the technological and tactical advantages that the Highland forces brought to bear. Iron weapons cut through bronze armor as if it were cloth. Coordinated chariot charges broke defensive formations that had successfully resisted traditional enemies for centuries. Most devastating of all, the sheer audacity of the attack created psychological pressure that gradually wore down even the most determined resistance. The final assault came after weeks of siege operations that had gradually reduced the city's defensive capabilities to the breaking point. When the walls were finally breached, Highland forces poured into the metropolis with a fury that reflected not just the frustrations of the siege, but the accumulated momentum of their entire impossible journey. What followed was systematic plunder on a scale that shocked even hardened veterans of previous campaigns. The wealth seized during the sack of the ancient capital exceeded anything previously seen in Highland territories. Gold and silver, accumulated over centuries of Mesopotamian prosperity, filled wagon after wagon. Precious stones, ivory carvings, and masterworks of art were loaded onto pack animals for the long journey home. Most valuable of all were the skilled craftsmen, scholars, and administrators who were deported to serve the mountain state with their expertise. Yet the true significance of the victory lay not in material plunder, but in its psychological impact throughout the ancient world. For the first time in recorded history, a foreign power had successfully captured and sacked the greatest city of the most ancient civilization on Earth. The implications were staggering, not just for political and strategic calculations, but for fundamental assumptions about divine favor, cultural superiority, and the natural order of the world. News of the metropolis's fall spread across the ancient Near East with the speed of wildfire, carrying shockwaves that reached from Egypt to the Iranian plateau. Rulers who had previously dismissed the Highland state as a regional nuisance suddenly recognized it as a threat to the entire established order. Diplomatic correspondence from the period reveals growing panic among established powers, who realized that their world was changing in ways they could neither predict nor control. The Highland withdrawal from the conquered metropolis proved as masterful as the advance had been. Rather than attempting to hold territory so far from their base of power, Mursili's forces departed with their plunder before any coalition of enemies could organize effective retaliation. The Great Raid had achieved its primary objectives, demonstrating Highland power capabilities, securing enormous wealth, and establishing the young ruler's credentials as a worthy successor to his grandfather's legacy. The impact on Highland society itself was equally profound. Veterans returning from the historic venture brought not just plunder, but stories that would shape cultural development for generations. The successful completion of such an impossible undertaking created a sense of national destiny and divine favor that would sustain the mountain state through future challenges. Most importantly, the operation established precedents for long-distance campaigns that would influence strategic thinking throughout the classical period. However, success came with hidden costs that would not become apparent until years later. The concentration of armed forces required for the historic raid had left other frontiers vulnerable to enemy action. Rebellions that had been brewing during the succession crisis erupted with renewed vigor, while the main force was absent from the homeland. Most critically, the venture's very success attracted the hostile attention of powers that had previously ignored the Highland state as irrelevant to their strategic calculations. The young ruler returned home to find his territories in chaos. Provincial governors had declared independence in multiple regions. Egyptian forces had launched probing attacks along the southern frontiers. Mesopotamian diplomats were actively encouraging rebellion among recently conquered populations by offering tactical support and favorable trade agreements to those willing to break away from Highland control. Yet Mursili's position was now fundamentally stronger despite these immediate challenges. The wealth seized from the ancient capital provided resources to finance counter-insurgency operations throughout the territories. The psychological impact of the raid's success undermined rebel morale while strengthening loyalist resolve. Most importantly, The young monarch had established his personal credentials as a tactical genius capable of achieving the impossible. The suppression of rebellions that followed demonstrated how thoroughly the Highland state had internalized the lessons of governing diverse populations across vast territories. Rather than relying purely on armed force, administrators combined coercion with incentives that addressed legitimate grievances while maintaining central authority. Local rulers who had participated in rebellions faced execution or deportation, but their territories were then governed through more responsive institutions that provided better representation for local interests. The integration of plunder from the Great Raid into the Highland economy created new opportunities and challenges that would shape development for decades to come. Skilled craftsmen deported from Mesopotamia introduced new techniques in metallurgy, architecture, and artistic production that enriched Highland culture while maintaining its distinctive character. Scholars familiar with Mesopotamian literature and law contributed to legal and administrative innovations that enhanced governmental effectiveness. Perhaps most significantly, the venture's success established the Highland state as a recognized great power that could no longer be ignored by established civilizations. Diplomatic relationships that had previously been based on the condescending tolerance of superior powers were replaced by negotiations between equals who respected each other's capabilities. This transformation opened new possibilities for alliance, trade, and cultural exchange that would benefit all parties involved. The Great Raid also created precedents for future operations that would influence strategic thinking throughout the ancient world. The demonstration that well-organized forces equipped with superior technology could successfully project power across vast distances encouraged other ambitious rulers to attempt similar ventures. More importantly, it established the Highland state's reputation as the most formidable combat power of its age, a reputation that would deter potential enemies while attracting allies seeking protection or partnership. Yet the very success that elevated the mountain state to great power status also created new vulnerabilities that would test every aspect of its institutional strength. The wealth and prestige gained through the historic raid made Highland territories increasingly attractive targets for other ambitious powers. The demonstration of long-distance operational capabilities revealed both strengths and weaknesses that careful observers could exploit in future conflicts. Most critically, the venture's success created expectations among the Highland population that future rulers would be measured against the standards set by Mursili's impossible achievement. This psychological pressure would influence strategic decision-making for generations, sometimes encouraging bold initiatives that enhanced state power, but other times leading to reckless gambles that threatened everything previous generations had built. The young ruler's triumph would prove to be both the culmination of early Highland expansion and the beginning of a new phase in which the state would have to learn how to exercise great power responsibilities while maintaining the aggressive spirit that had carried it to prominence. The lessons learned during the historic raid would be tested repeatedly in the challenges that lay ahead. Challenges that would determine whether the Highland state could sustain its position among the great powers of the ancient world, or whether its meteoric rise would be followed by equally dramatic decline. The age of impossible raids was ending. The age of great power diplomacy and sustained competition was about to begin. The palace at Hattusa had never been quieter. In the winter of 1590 BC, just 5 years after his triumphant return from the impossible raid on the Mesopotamian capital, Mursili I lay dead in his chamber, not from enemy action or battlefield wounds, but from the blade of his own brother-in-law. The assassination sent shockwaves through a realm that had grown accustomed to spectacular victories and unending growth. For the first time in generations, the throne was occupied by blood rather than glory. Hantili, the assassin who seized power, justified his actions by claiming divine displeasure with Mursili's reckless adventures. The gods had shown their anger, he declared, by allowing the Great Raid to unleash a terrible plague upon the homeland, a pestilence that Greek captives had unknowingly carried back from their distant campaign. Thousands had died in the years following the victory, including members of the royal family itself. Someone had to pay for this catastrophe, and Mursili bore ultimate responsibility for leading his people into divine wrath. But whatever religious justification Hantili offered, his coup marked the beginning of the darkest period in the kingdom's history. The new ruler possessed neither the charisma nor the tactical genius of his predecessors. Within months of seizing power, rebellions erupted across the realm as local governors sensed weakness at the center. Egyptian forces launched probing attacks along southern frontiers. Mesopotamian monarchs encouraged defections among recently conquered populations. Most critically, the mountain tribes known as the Kaska began their relentless pressure against the homeland itself. The Kaska represented everything the Anatolian power had sought to transcend. These tribal peoples lived in the rugged mountains north of Hattusa, their society organized around clan loyalties and seasonal warfare rather than the sophisticated administrative systems that had enabled territorial growth. They possessed no cities, built no monuments, and left no written records. Yet they understood Anatolian weaknesses better than any sophisticated enemy. Their raids began as opportunistic strikes against isolated settlements, but gradually escalated into coordinated campaigns that threatened the very heart of the realm. Unlike traditional enemies who fought set-piece battles, where Anatolian technological advantages could prove decisive, the Kaska employed hit-and-run tactics that neutralized superior equipment and organization. They struck without warning, disappeared into mountain fastnesses before retaliation could be organized, and returned whenever the royal forces were occupied elsewhere. The psychological impact of these tribal incursions proved as devastating as their material damage. For generations, Anatolian identity had been built around the concept of civilized superiority over barbarian neighbors. The successful conquest of sophisticated southern cities had reinforced this sense of cultural destiny. Now primitive mountain dwellers were laying waste to regions that had seemed permanently secure, revealing fundamental vulnerabilities in the system that had carried the empire to greatness. Hantili's response to these mounting crises revealed the limitations of rule based purely on political manipulation rather than proven competence. His forces won occasional victories against Kaska raiding parties, but could never eliminate the threat entirely. Rebellious provinces were sometimes brought back under central control, but at enormous cost in resources and manpower. Most critically, the ruler failed to inspire the kind of loyalty that had enabled previous monarchs to overcome seemingly impossible challenges. The plague that had provided Hantili's justification for seizing power continued ravaging the highland population throughout his reign. Cities that had flourished during the expansion period saw their populations decimated by disease. Agricultural production declined as farming communities were abandoned or consolidated. Trade networks that had generated enormous wealth during previous decades contracted as merchants sought safer routes through territories controlled by more stable powers. Religious explanations for these catastrophes multiplied as priests struggled to understand why the gods had apparently abandoned their chosen people. Some blamed the sack of foreign temples during the Great Raids. Others pointed to violations of traditional customs, as the state had absorbed foreign influences. Still others argued that the dynasty itself had lost divine favor and needed to be replaced by rulers more acceptable to the celestial powers. The succession crisis that followed Hantili's eventual death in 1560 BC nearly destroyed the Anatolian Empire entirely. Multiple claimants emerged from different branches of the royal family, each supported by different commanders and administrative factions. The resulting civil war lasted over a decade and consumed resources that could have been used to address external threats or internal renewal. Over these chaotic years, the regions conquered by earlier kings gradually slipped away from central control. Syrian cities declared independence and sought protection from Egyptian or Mesopotamian patrons. Anatolian provinces fell under the influence of local strongmen who owed no allegiance to Hattusa. Most devastatingly, Kaska tribes expanded their control over areas that had been considered secure royal territory for generations. By 1550 BC, the empire that had once threatened the greatest powers of the ancient world controlled little more than the immediate vicinity of its capital. The iron monopoly that had provided technological advantages was breaking down as production facilities were disrupted by warfare and their skilled workers fled to safer lands. The administrative systems that had enabled governance of diverse populations across vast distances fragmented into competing bureaucracies serving rival claimants to power. Yet even in this darkest hour, certain institutional foundations remained strong enough to support eventual recovery. The legal traditions developed over previous reigns continued operating in regions still under central control. Religious practices that had successfully integrated diverse populations maintained their appeal even when political authority collapsed. Most importantly, the cultural identity forged through earlier conquests survived political fragmentation and provided a foundation for future renewal. The individual who would begin this remarkable recovery came from an unexpected source. Telepinu was neither a successful general nor a charismatic leader, but rather a younger son of the royal family who had spent his early career as a provincial administrator. His experience governing local regions had taught him lessons about the practical requirements of effective rule that court-based politicians had never learned. When Telepinu finally succeeded in eliminating his rivals and claiming undisputed control around 1525 BC, he faced challenges that would have overwhelmed kings accustomed to the straightforward problems of conquest and foreign adventure. The empire needed to be rebuilt from the ground up, not just its lands and wealth, but its fundamental institutions and cultural identity. Traditional approaches based on armed strength and foreign adventure were clearly inadequate for the renewal required. The new monarch's first priority was ending the cycle of internal violence that had consumed royal resources for decades. Rather than simply executing remaining rivals and their supporters, Telepinu issued comprehensive pardons that allowed former enemies to participate in the renewal effort. More importantly, he established formal procedures for royal succession that would prevent future civil wars by clearly defining how power would be transferred from one generation to the next. These succession laws represented one of the most important constitutional innovations in ancient history. Previous Anatolian kings had designated their heirs while alive, but without formal constraints that prevented later changes or challenges from rival claimants. Telepinu's legislation specified that only direct male descendants could inherit the throne, established procedures for regencies when heirs were too young to rule, and created institutional mechanisms for resolving disputes without resort to civil war. The diplomatic revolution that accompanied internal renewal proved equally significant for long-term recovery. Rather than attempting to reconquer lost provinces through campaigns that the weakened empire could not afford, Telepinu negotiated agreements that preserved Anatolian influence through less expensive means. some former regions accepted tributary relationships that provided them autonomy in exchange for annual payments and armed support when emergencies arose. Religious reforms addressed the spiritual crisis that had undermined popular confidence in royal authority. New ceremonies emphasized the gods' continued favor for the Anatolian people while acknowledging past errors that had temporarily disrupted divine protection. Traditional festivals were restored and expanded, providing communal experiences that reinforced cultural identity even when political control remained fragmented. The economic dimension of renewal required fundamental changes in how the empire generated and managed its resources. The tribute and plunder that had funded earlier conquests were no longer available, forcing development of more sustainable revenue sources. Agricultural production was encouraged through tax incentives and infrastructure investments. Craft production received royal support to rebuild the export industries that had enriched Anatolian cities in previous decades. Most critically, the iron monopoly was gradually restored through careful protection of remaining production facilities and recruitment of skilled workers who had fled in the chaotic years. This technological advantage remained crucial to Anatolian combat effectiveness, but its strategic value now lay more in defensive applications than in supporting offensive campaigns against distant enemies. The gradual recovery of highland power during Telepinu's reign established patterns that would influence development for centuries to come. Territorial expansion was replaced by careful consolidation of existing resources. Military adventures gave way to diplomatic solutions wherever possible. Most importantly, the ruler demonstrated that effective governance required institutions capable of surviving individual personalities rather than depending on the charisma or genius of particular monarchs. The Casca threat that had seemed so overwhelming during the crisis years was gradually contained through a combination of military pressure and diplomatic accommodation. Rather than attempting to conquer or eliminate these tribal peoples entirely, Highland forces established defensive lines that protected core territories while allowing the Casca to maintain their traditional way of life in marginal mountain regions. This pragmatic approach proved far more sustainable than the total conquest strategies favored by earlier rulers. International relations during the Reconstruction period reflected the Highland state's reduced circumstances while preserving its essential dignity and independence. Diplomatic correspondence with Egypt and Mesopotamian powers acknowledged Highland weakness while maintaining claims to great power status. Marriage alliances with neighboring rulers provided security guarantees that military strength could no longer ensure. Most importantly, careful neutrality in conflicts between other major powers prevented the Highland state from being drawn into wars it could not afford. The cultural achievements of this recovery period often receive less attention than the spectacular conquests of earlier reigns, but they proved equally important for long-term development. Legal codes were refined and expanded to address the complexities of governing regions that had experienced decades of disruption. Literary traditions were preserved and enhanced through royal patronage of scribal schools. Architectural projects, though more modest than the monuments built in earlier periods, demonstrated continuing royal authority and divine favor. Perhaps most significantly, the recovery established new models for Anatolian leadership that emphasized administrative competence and institutional stability rather than combat glory and personal charisma. Future kings would still need to demonstrate warrior virtues when circumstances required, but they would also be expected to master the complex skills of diplomacy, law-giving, and economic management that Telepinu had shown to be equally important for effective governance. By 1500 BC, 30 years after beginning his reign, Amid the ruins of Anatolian power, Telepinu had accomplished what many contemporaries considered impossible. The empire was not merely surviving, but beginning to prosper again. Core regions were secure from external threats. Internal institutions functioned effectively without constant royal intervention. Most importantly, the cultural confidence that had originally enabled Anatolian growth was gradually returning as people rediscovered pride in their distinctive achievements and capabilities. The stage was being set for a new phase of Anatolian development that would combine the aggressive spirit of earlier conquests with the institutional sophistication learned through the recovery period. Future kings would inherit not just lands and resources, but constitutional frameworks, diplomatic networks, and administrative capabilities that would enable them to project Anatolian power more effectively and sustainably than ever before. The kingdoms that emerged from this crucible of crisis and recovery would prove capable of challenging the greatest powers of their age, while maintaining the internal stability that earlier monarchs had sometimes sacrificed in pursuit of combat glory. The lessons learned in the dark years would serve Anatolian civilization well in the great confrontations that lay ahead. But first, the empire would need to complete its recovery and rebuild the armed capabilities that had once made Anatolian forces the terror of the ancient world. The next generation of kings would face the challenge of translating institutional renewal into renewed conquest, a task that would test every lesson learned through the years of crisis and recovery. The age of rebuilding was drawing to a close. The age of renewed greatness was about to begin. The storm clouds were gathering over the ancient world. By 1380 BC, four great powers dominated the civilized earth: Egypt controlling the Nile Valley and southern Levant, Assyria rising in northern Mesopotamia, Mitanni commanding the Levantine heartland, and the Mountain Kingdom, now fully recovered from its decades of crisis. For generations, these empires had coexisted through careful diplomacy and mutual respect. That delicate balance was about to shatter. At the center of this brewing tempest stood a man whose very name would become synonymous with conquest and cunning. The great king ascended the throne around 1344 BC with ambitions that dwarfed those of any monarch since the legendary Mursili. Where his immediate predecessors had focused on consolidation and recovery, this new ruler dreamed of nothing less than reshaping the entire Near Eastern world order. The situation that confronted the monarch presented both unprecedented opportunities and mortal dangers. The Hurrian kingdom, which had dominated the Levant for over a century, was tearing itself apart through civil war. Egyptian power, though still formidable, was distracted by religious revolution as the pharaoh Akhenaten abandoned traditional gods in favor of a radical new solar monotheism. Assyria remained focused on eastern expansion rather than western adventures. Most critically, none of these powers possessed the technological advantages that had originally carried the mountain forces to greatness. The iron monopoly, carefully rebuilt following Telepinu's reforms, once again gave highland armies decisive superiority over bronze-equipped opponents. But the king understood that technology alone would not be enough to achieve his grand ambitions. Success would require diplomatic genius, tactical innovation, and the kind of sustained campaign coordination that had been perfected through decades of border warfare against the persistent Kaska tribes. The monarch's first moves revealed the sophisticated planning that would characterize his entire reign. Rather than launching immediate attacks against obvious targets, he spent years building the intelligence networks and alliance systems that would enable later campaigns. Mountain agents, disguised as merchants and diplomats, penetrated Hurrian territories to assess defensive capabilities and identify potential collaborators among disaffected local populations. Simultaneously, diplomatic initiatives reached out to Egypt and Assyria with carefully crafted messages that emphasized shared interests in maintaining regional stability while subtly probing for signs of weakness or opportunity. These early negotiations established the ruler's reputation as a thoughtful and reasonable monarch, a reputation that would prove invaluable when his true intentions became clear. The religious dimension of preparation proved equally crucial to long-term success. The great king presented his eventual campaigns not as naked aggression, but as divine missions to restore proper worship throughout the Levantine territories. Hurrian rulers, he declared, had violated sacred traditions by neglecting the storm god and other deities who demanded universal reverence. Highland armies would march not as conquerors, but as liberators, freeing oppressed populations from impious monarchs who had lost divine favor. This theological framework provided powerful justification for what might otherwise have appeared as unprovoked aggression. More importantly, it created emotional connections with Levantine populations who had indeed grown resentful of Hurrian religious policies that often favored foreign deities over traditional local cults. When mountain forces eventually crossed the Euphrates, many cities would welcome them as deliverers rather than resist them as invaders. The preparations that accompanied diplomatic and religious initiatives demonstrated how thoroughly Highland thinking had evolved since the chaotic years of the previous century. Gone were the days of improvised expeditions launched on royal whim. The king's campaigns would be characterized by meticulous planning, overwhelming logistical support, and coordination between multiple army groups operating across vast distances. Chariot forces received new vehicles specifically designed for the Levantine terrain, with wheels adapted for sand and rocky ground, rather than the mountain paths where they had originally proven their worth. Infantry equipment was standardized to simplify supply requirements while maintaining the qualitative advantages that iron weapons provided over bronze alternatives. Most importantly, engineering units were expanded and trained in siege techniques that could reduce fortified cities quickly enough to prevent enemy coalitions from organizing effective relief efforts. The intelligence apparatus that supported these preparations represented perhaps the monarch's greatest innovation. Previous Highland campaigns had relied on crude reconnaissance and local informants of questionable reliability. The new ruler established systematic espionage networks that penetrated enemy territories years before actual hostilities commenced. These agents provided detailed information about defensive preparations, garrison strengths, supply routes, and political tensions that could be exploited when warfare began. Perhaps most ingeniously, Highland diplomats began cultivating relationships with Levantine city rulers who chafed under Hurrian domination. These local leaders were promised autonomy and favorable treatment in exchange for cooperation when mountain armies arrived. By the time open warfare commenced, the king had already secured the loyalty of key figures throughout the territories he intended to conquer. The first phase of Levantine expansion began around 1340 BC, with what appeared to be limited border adjustments rather than full-scale invasion. Highland forces crossed the Euphrates at multiple points, seizing key strongholds that controlled major trade routes while carefully avoiding direct confrontation with main Hurrian armies. These initial operations were presented as responses to border violations and protection of mountain merchants rather than territorial conquest. This graduated escalation served multiple purposes. It allowed the monarch to test Hurrian responses and assess the effectiveness of his reformed armies without committing to irreversible conflict. It demonstrated Highland capabilities to potential allies and enemies throughout the region. Most importantly, it created a series of accomplished facts that shifted the balance gradually rather than provoking immediate coalition warfare against the expanding kingdom. The Hurrian response revealed the fundamental weaknesses that the king had correctly identified in his calculations. King Tushratta, distracted by internal rebellions and religious disputes, could not organize effective resistance to the initial highland incursions. His appeals for assistance from Egypt and Assyria received polite but non-committal responses from powers that had their own priorities. Most critically, the Levantine cities that should have formed the backbone of Hurrian resistance began defecting to the mountain cause as soon as enemy armies appeared on the horizon. The psychological impact of these early successes created momentum that carried highland expansion far beyond what initial planning had envisioned. Cities that had prepared for lengthy sieges opened their gates when they realized that resistance was futile. Regional governors who had sworn loyalty to the Hurrians switched sides when they calculated that mountain victory was inevitable. Most dramatically, several major Levantine centers actually invited highland occupation as protection against the chaos that was consuming the Hurrian heartland. By 1335 BC, just 5 years after beginning his Levantine adventure, the great king controlled most of northern regions and was preparing to strike at the very heart of Hurrian power. The speed of this conquest astonished contemporary observers throughout the ancient world. Never before had such extensive territories changed hands so quickly, with so little apparent effort from the conquering power. Yet success bred new challenges that tested every aspect of highland institutional capability. The territories now under royal control were far more extensive and culturally diverse than anything previous monarchs had attempted to govern. Unlike the mountain heartland, where generations of cultural fusion had created relatively homogeneous populations, the Levant contained dozens of distinct ethnic groups with their own languages, religious traditions, and political loyalties. The monarch's solution to these administrative challenges demonstrated the political sophistication that had been developed through decades of internal reform. Rather than attempting to impose uniform highland practices throughout the conquered territories, the king established a flexible system that adapted to local conditions while maintaining central authority over essential functions. Levantine cities that had welcomed highland forces retained their traditional rulers and religious practices under loose royal oversight. Those that had resisted were incorporated more directly into the mountain administrative system, but with guarantees that local customs would be respected. Most importantly, the ruler avoided the mistake of earlier conquerors who had attempted to extract maximum short-term wealth from conquered territories at the expense of long-term stability. The economic integration of Levantine territories into the highland system created new sources of wealth that funded further expansion while enhancing prosperity throughout the kingdom. Local craftsmen brought new techniques in textiles, metalworking, and luxury goods production. Regional merchants provided access to trade networks that connected the Mediterranean coast with Mesopotamian markets. Most importantly, Levantine agricultural production supplemented highland food supplies and freed additional manpower for service. The religious syncretism that had characterized earlier highland expansion reached new levels of sophistication as the kingdom absorbed Levantine spiritual traditions. Local deities were incorporated into the royal pantheon, with elaborate ceremonies that emphasized theological compatibility rather than foreign domination. Regional priests retained their positions and influence, while acknowledging the supreme authority of the Highland storm god. This careful balance between innovation and tradition created emotional bonds between ruler and ruled that pure coercion could never have achieved. However, the very success of Levantine expansion created new vulnerabilities that the monarch had not fully anticipated. The rapid collapse of Hurrian power left a vacuum that other regional powers rushed to fill. Egyptian armies began moving northward to reassert pharaonic control over territories that had been considered secure Egyptian spheres of influence. Assyrian forces probed westward to test whether the new Highland Empire could defend its expanded frontiers. Most ominously, rumors spread throughout diplomatic circles of a potential coalition that would unite all threatened powers against the upstart kingdom. The ruler's response to these mounting pressures revealed both the strengths and limitations of his vision. Rather than consolidating his Levantine gains and seeking accommodation with threatened neighbors, the great king chose further escalation, designed to secure his conquests through overwhelming superiority rather than diplomatic compromise. This decision would lead to the most dramatic confrontation of his reign and establish precedents that would influence Near Eastern politics for centuries to come. The target of this escalation was Egypt itself, not through direct invasion of the Nile Valley, which would have been logistically impossible, but through systematic pressure on Egyptian-controlled territories in the southern Levant. Highland armies began operating in regions that pharaonic forces had considered secure for generations. Levantine allies of the Mountain Kingdom launched raids against Egyptian vassals. Most provocatively, Highland diplomats began encouraging rebellions among local rulers who resented Egyptian domination. This expansion of conflict beyond the northern Levant fundamentally altered the balance throughout the ancient Near East. No longer was this a regional dispute between the Mountain Kingdom and the collapsing Hurrian Empire. It had become a direct challenge to Egyptian hegemony over the entire Levantine corridor, the crucial link between Africa and Asia that had provided the foundation for pharaonic power since the dawn of recorded history. The Egyptian response, when it finally came, would test every aspect of Highland preparation. Pharaoh Amenhotep III, abandoning his previous policy of cautious neutrality, began mobilizing the full resources of the Nile Valley for a confrontation that would determine whether Egyptian or Highland power would dominate the ancient world's most critical region. As armies gathered on both sides of the expanding conflict zone, the great king found himself facing the ultimate test of his grand design. Success would establish Highland hegemony over territories stretching from the Black Sea to the borders of Egypt itself. Failure would likely result in the destruction of everything his kingdom had achieved since recovering from its earlier crisis. The stage was set for a confrontation that would reshape the ancient world and establish patterns of great power competition that would endure for centuries. The question was no longer whether Highland expansion could continue, but whether the kingdom possessed the institutional strength and wisdom to manage the consequences of its own spectacular success. But even as these great forces maneuvered for the decisive confrontation that would determine the future of the Near East, an unexpected opportunity would arise that would test the monarch's diplomatic skills as thoroughly as his capabilities had been tested on the Levantine battlefields. From the palace of the pharaohs themselves would come an offer so extraordinary that it would force the Highland ruler to reconsider everything he thought he knew about the possibilities and dangers of great power politics. The age of conquest was about to give way to the age of diplomacy, intrigue, and deadly miscalculation. The greatest crisis of the reign was approaching, a crisis that would arise not from enemy strength but from enemy weakness, not from defeat but from political opportunity, too tempting to resist and too dangerous to accept. The message arrived at Hattusa on a rain-soaked autumn evening in 1323 BC, carried by an envoy whose exhausted horses and mud-splattered robes spoke of desperate urgency. What the ambassador carried would go down in history as one of the most extraordinary diplomatic communications ever sent between great powers. A letter that would unleash a chain of events leading to plague, war, and ultimately the collapse of the Bronze Age world itself. The letter came from Ankhesenamun, widow of the young pharaoh Tutankhamun, who had died unexpectedly, leaving Egypt without a clear successor. Faced with the prospect of marriage to an elderly advisor she despised, the young queen had taken an unprecedented step. She was writing directly to the Highland Empire's great king, with an offer that defied every diplomatic convention of the ancient world. "My husband has died, and I have no son. They say about you that you have many sons. If you would give me one of your sons, he would become my husband. I would never pick out a servant of mine and make him my husband." The implications were staggering. If a Highland prince married the pharaoh's widow, he would become pharaoh of the greatest power in the ancient world. The two empires that had been maneuvering toward war would instead be united through the most intimate of political bonds. Nile Valley wealth and mountain prowess would combine to create a superpower that could dominate the entire Near East for generations to come. For weeks, the great king deliberated. His advisors were divided between those who saw unprecedented opportunity and others who warned of pharaonic treachery. Previous pharaohs had occasionally married foreign princesses, but never had a Nile Valley queen sought a foreign husband. The very uniqueness of the offer suggested either desperation or deception, yet the potential rewards were too enormous to dismiss without careful consideration. Finally, Suppiluliuma reached his decision. He would send his son, Zananza, to Egypt, but only after pharaonic intentions had been verified through careful investigation. Highland agents were dispatched to the Nile Valley to assess the political situation and ensure that this extraordinary proposal was genuine rather than an elaborate trap designed to lure a royal prince to his destruction. The intelligence reports that returned were encouraging. Tutankhamun was indeed dead, apparently from injuries sustained in a chariot accident. The young queen was genuinely isolated at court, surrounded by aging advisors who sought to control the succession for their own benefit. Most importantly, there appeared to be no immediate alternative to foreign marriage if Ankhesenamun wanted to avoid becoming a political pawn in the hands of ambitious courtiers. With these assurances, Zananza set out for Egypt in the spring of 1322 BC, accompanied by a small but elite escort befitting a prince who might soon become pharaoh. The journey through the Levantine regions, recently brought under Highland control, proceeded without incident. Local rulers provided supplies and fresh horses, while treating the prince with the deference due to a future pharaoh. Everything seemed to be proceeding according to plan. Then came devastating news. Somewhere in the contested borderlands between Highland and pharaonic power, the prince and his entire escort had been ambushed and killed. Whether this was the work of Nile Valley agents, local bandits, or rival Highland factions remained unclear. What mattered was that the most promising diplomatic initiative in Highland history had ended in blood and betrayal. The great king's response was swift and terrible. Pharaonic treachery, for he had no doubt that Nile Valley authorities were responsible for his son's murder, demanded immediate punishment. Highland armies that had been preparing for defensive operations were redirected toward offensive campaigns designed to bring pharaonic domains under direct Highland control. The age of diplomacy was over. The age of total war had begun. The campaigns that followed demonstrated both the strengths and limitations of Highland armed power at its peak. Pharaonic garrisons throughout the Levantine regions were overwhelmed by the speed and violence of the Highland response. Cities that had maintained nominal Nile Valley allegiance for generations found themselves occupied by iron-armed Highland forces, who showed no mercy to those suspected of collaboration with the prince's murderers. Yet these tactical victories came at enormous cost. The Highland Empire had committed its primary forces to offensive operations far from home at precisely the moment when new threats were emerging on other frontiers. Assyrian armies began probing highland domains in northern Mesopotamia. Kaska tribes resumed their traditional raids against highland settlements. Most ominously, reports arrived of strange movements among the seafaring peoples of the Aegean and eastern Mediterranean. The great king himself would not live to see the full consequences of his fateful decision to seek vengeance for his son's death. Suppiluliuma died suddenly in 1322 BC, apparently a victim of the plague that Pharaonic captives had brought back to the Highland heartland. His death marked the end of an era and the beginning of a period of crisis that would test every institution and tradition that had sustained Highland culture for centuries. The succession passed to Mursili II, a capable prince who inherited not just a throne, but a nightmare of military, diplomatic, and epidemiological disasters. The plague that had killed his father was spreading throughout Highland territories, decimating populations that provided the manpower for both agricultural production and military service. Egyptian resistance in the Levantine territories was hardening as Pharaonic forces recovered from their initial shock and began organizing systematic counterattacks. Most critically, the new king faced what appeared to be divine displeasure on an unprecedented scale. Highland religious traditions had always emphasized the gods' favor for their chosen people, but now every aspect of Highland life seemed cursed by supernatural wrath. Crops failed, livestock died, armies suffered unexpected defeats, and even the royal family itself was not immune to the diseases ravaging the general population. Mursili's response to these mounting crises revealed both personal courage and institutional wisdom that would enable Highland civilization to survive its darkest hour. Rather than attempting to maintain offensive operations that the kingdom could no longer afford, he ordered a general strategic withdrawal from the most exposed positions while concentrating available resources on defending core territories that were essential to Highland survival. This consolidation was not accomplished without enormous sacrifice. Levantine regions that had been conquered at such great cost were abandoned to Pharaonic reconquest. Highland settlers who had established communities in these areas were forced to flee, leaving behind homes and possessions accumulated over generations. Most painfully, the graves of Highland heroes, including the great Suppiluliuma himself, were left in lands that would soon return to Pharaonic control. Yet this withdrawal saved Highland culture from complete destruction. By reducing commitments to sustainable levels, Mursili freed resources for addressing the internal challenges that threatened the empire's very existence. Medical knowledge, accumulated through generations of royal patronage, was mobilized to combat the plague. Administrative systems developed through decades of territorial expansion were adapted to coordinate relief efforts for affected populations. Perhaps most importantly, the new king demonstrated remarkable skill in maintaining morale among populations that had every reason to despair. Rather than attempting to minimize the scale of the disasters confronting Highland society, Mursili acknowledged the gods' apparent anger while insisting that divine favor could be restored through proper ritual observance and moral reform. The religious response to the crisis took the form of elaborate ceremonies designed to identify and expiate whatever sins had provoked divine wrath. Highland priests consulted ancient texts, interrogated oracles, and performed complex rituals in attempts to determine why the gods had apparently abandoned their chosen people. These investigations eventually focused on possible violations of sacred oaths and treaties that might have disrupted the cosmic order. The plague prayers of Mursili II, preserved on cuneiform tablets discovered by modern archaeologists, provide extraordinary insight into how ancient rulers grappled with disasters beyond their control. In language of remarkable directness and emotional power, the king acknowledged his people's suffering while appealing to divine mercy. "What is this, O gods, that you have done? A plague you have let into the land. The land, all of it, is dying, so no one prepares food offerings and libation for you. The ox herds who used to tend the sacrificial sheep and cattle of the gods are dead, so the sacrificial sheep and cattle of the gods are gone." These appeals apparently had some effect. The worst phase of the plague gradually subsided, though it would return periodically for decades and permanently reduce highland population levels. Agricultural production slowly recovered as surviving farmers adapted their techniques to work larger areas with reduced labor forces. Most importantly, armed effectiveness was gradually restored as new generations of warriors replaced those lost to disease and warfare. The process of recovery was aided by fundamental changes in Highland diplomatic and combat strategy that reflected hard-learned lessons about the limits of Highland power. Gone were the grandiose ambitions that had driven Suppiluliuma's expansion into the Levantine regions. In their place came a more modest but sustainable approach that emphasized defensive strength and careful alliance management rather than territorial conquest. This new strategy was tested almost immediately by the emergence of threats that dwarfed anything Highland society had previously confronted. Beginning around 1200 BC, mysterious groups of seafaring peoples began attacking established societies throughout the eastern Mediterranean. These raiders, known to modern historians as the Sea Peoples, possessed advanced naval technology and combat tactics that proved devastatingly effective against traditional land-based defenses. The Sea Peoples' origins remain one of history's great mysteries. Some appear to have come from the Aegean Islands, others from the western Mediterranean, still others from regions that cannot be identified with certainty. What united them was their apparent displacement from their original homelands and their determination to establish new domains through conquest of existing societies. Their impact on the ancient world was catastrophic. Mycenaean Greece collapsed entirely, its palace centers destroyed, and its population scattered. The empire's western regions fell to Sea Peoples' raids that overwhelmed highland garrisons, already weakened by decades of plague and warfare. Most shockingly, even mighty Egypt barely survived a series of massive invasions that brought foreign armies to the very gates of the pharaoh's capitals. For Highland society, the Sea Peoples represented an existential threat that conventional responses could not address. Traditional Highland tactics had been developed for warfare against organized states, with recognizable political structures and predictable objectives. The Sea Peoples followed no such patterns. They appeared without warning, struck with devastating effectiveness, and disappeared before retaliation could be organized. The Highland response to this unprecedented threat demonstrated both the strengths and limitations of their political and armed systems. Coastal regions were largely abandoned as indefensible against seaborne raiders who could strike at any point along hundreds of miles of shoreline. Available forces were concentrated around the capital and other vital centers that absolutely had to be held regardless of cost. This defensive strategy succeeded in protecting Highland society's essential core, but at enormous cost in land, population, and prestige. The empire that had once projected power from the Black Sea to the borders of Egypt now controlled little more than the central Turkish plateau where Highland culture had originally emerged. International influence that had been built through centuries of diplomatic and armed success evaporated as highland power contracted to its ancestral heartland. Yet even this reduced empire proved incapable of long-term survival in the chaotic conditions that characterized the eastern Mediterranean following the Sea People's invasions. The economic systems that had sustained highland society depended on trade networks and tribute relationships that could not function in an environment of constant warfare and political fragmentation. Agricultural production, already reduced by population losses, suffered further disruption as rural areas became unsafe for normal farming activities. Craft production declined as workshops lost their skilled workers and their markets for luxury goods. Most critically, the iron technology that had provided highland advantages for centuries began spreading to other peoples as highland territorial control contracted and metallurgical secrets could no longer be protected. The final crisis came around 1180 BC, with what appears to have been a coordinated assault on highland domains by multiple enemy groups. Sea peoples, Kaska tribes, and various regional peoples who had never accepted highland hegemony joined forces to destroy what remained of highland power. The capital at Hattusa was abandoned, its massive walls and impressive palaces left to crumble, as the royal court fled to more defensible positions in the south. Archaeological evidence suggests that this final abandonment was hasty but organized. Valuable objects were removed, important documents were hidden or destroyed, and defensive preparations were made as if the inhabitants expected to return when conditions improved. These hopes would prove illusory. Highland society, as an independent political and cultural force, had come to an end. Some highland populations survived in the southeastern regions of Asia Minor, where they established smaller states that maintained certain cultural traditions while adapting to the new realities of the post-Bronze Age world. These Neo-Hittite realms, as modern historians call them, preserved elements of highland law, religion, and artistic expression for several more centuries, before they too were absorbed into the expanding empires of Assyria and Persia. The collapse of highland society was part of a broader transformation that affected the entire eastern Mediterranean world around 1200 BC. The Bronze Age system of palace-centered states engaging in long-distance trade and diplomacy gave way to a more fragmented world of smaller political units struggling to survive in conditions of constant insecurity and economic disruption. Yet the legacy of highland achievement would endure long after highland political power had vanished. The diplomatic techniques developed through centuries of international relations would influence Greek and Roman practices. The legal traditions that had provided frameworks for governing diverse populations would contribute to later imperial systems. Most importantly, the iron technology that had given highland armies their decisive advantages would spread throughout the ancient world, ushering in the Iron Age that would define the next phase of human development. The story of highland society thus ends not with dramatic defeat, but with gradual adaptation to circumstances beyond any single empire's ability to control. Like other great Bronze Age societies, the Highland Empire fell victim to changes in technology, climate, and population movements that transformed the entire ancient world between 1200 and 1000 BC. The age of Highland greatness was over. The age of memory and rediscovery was about to begin. For over 3,000 years, one of the world's greatest powers lay buried beneath the dust of time. The names that had once struck terror into the hearts of pharaohs and Mesopotamian kings were forgotten. The cities that had commanded trade routes from the Black Sea to the borders of Egypt crumbled into anonymous mounds. The language that had produced the world's oldest Indo-European literature fell silent, its cuneiform tablets becoming mere curiosities scattered across the landscape of modern Turkey. the classical societies of Greece and Rome, inheritors of the Eastern Mediterranean world that emerged after the Bronze Age collapse, preserved no memory of the mountain kingdom that had once challenged Egypt for dominance over the Near East. Homer's epics, which recalled the Trojan War fought on Turkish soil, made no mention of the great power that had ruled those lands centuries earlier. Herodotus, the father of historical writing, wrote extensively about bygone empires, but knew nothing of the realm that had pioneered so many of the diplomatic and military innovations he attributed to later peoples. Even the Hebrew Bible, which preserved remarkably accurate memories of many Near Eastern powers, offered only tantalizing hints about a people called the Hittites. These biblical references described them as inhabitants of Canaan and sometime enemies of the Israelites, but gave no indication that they had once ruled a domain stretching across half the known world. To readers of scripture throughout the medieval and early modern periods, these people appeared to be merely another minor tribal group that had occupied small portions of the Holy Land. This amnesia was not accidental. The catastrophic collapse of Bronze Age society around 1200 BC had severed the cultural connections that might have preserved memory of earlier achievements. The successor states that emerged from the ruins inherited fragments of older traditions, but lacked the institutional continuity necessary to maintain complete records. Writing systems changed, languages evolved, and political structures were rebuilt from the ground up, leaving little room for preserving knowledge about vanished powers. The very thoroughness of the collapse worked against memory. Unlike other powers that declined gradually while leaving recognizable descendants, the Turkish kingdom disappeared so completely that its former existence became literally unimaginable. When later societies encountered the massive ruins scattered across the Turkish landscape, they attributed them to legendary giants or mythical heroes, rather than to a sophisticated Bronze Age realm. Islamic scholars, who preserved and expanded upon much classical knowledge during the medieval period, inherited the same blind spot. Arabic geographers and historians wrote extensively about Persia, Babylon, and Egypt, but made no reference to the power that had once united Anatolia and challenged these famous realms. The ruins at Hattusa, when noticed at all, were dismissed as the remains of some forgotten local settlement, rather than the capital of a great state. This darkness might have persisted indefinitely had it not been for a revolution in European scholarship that began during the 19th century. The decipherment of Egyptian hieroglyphs and Mesopotamian cuneiform opened new windows into the past, revealing societies and events that classical sources had never recorded. These breakthrough discoveries created an entirely new discipline, Egyptology and Assyriology, that used archaeological evidence and texts to reconstruct forgotten chapters of human experience. The first hints that the biblical people might represent something more than a minor tribal confederation came from Egyptian sources. The peace treaty between Pharaoh Ramses II and a Turkish ruler, carved on temple walls throughout Egypt, clearly indicated that the pharaoh had negotiated with a power of equal status. No minor Canaanite tribe could have commanded such respect from the master of the Nile Valley. Yet the treaty referred to this mysterious power by names that seemed to connect it with the biblical references. Even more intriguing were diplomatic letters discovered in the Egyptian records at Tel El Amarna. These 14th century BC tablets, written in Akkadian cuneiform, preserved correspondence between pharaohs and foreign rulers throughout the Near East. Among them were letters from kings of Hatti, who wrote as equals to the pharaohs and discussed matters of international diplomacy with sophisticated understanding of Near Eastern politics. The scale and tone of this correspondence suggested a major power, not a collection of city-states. French scholar Charles Texier provided the first concrete evidence for what this mysterious power might have been. In 1834, while exploring central Anatolia, he discovered the ruins of a city near the modern Turkish village of Boğazkale. The massive stone walls, elaborate gateways, and monumental sculptures clearly indicated a capital of enormous importance. Local villagers called the site Hattusa, preserving a name that would prove to be one of the most significant linguistic survivals in archaeological research. Texier's initial description of the ruins captured their imposing character. I suddenly found myself among the remains of a great city, surrounded by a wall built of enormous stones. The style of these ruins, the materials used in their construction, and the manner of their execution all indicate a people far advanced in their development. Yet even Texier could not have imagined that he was looking at the remains of a capital that had once commanded territories stretching from the Aegean to the Euphrates. The true breakthrough came in 1906, when German archaeologist Hugo Winkler began systematic excavations at Hattusa. Winkler had been drawn to the site by the presence of cuneiform inscriptions that suggested significant document collections might be buried beneath centuries of accumulated debris. His first season of digging yielded modest results, but in August 1906, his workers uncovered something extraordinary: the royal document collections of the Turkish kingdom. Tablet after tablet emerged from the excavation, thousands of cuneiform documents that had been carefully stored in the palace and temple complexes of the former capital. These collections contained everything from royal correspondence and international treaties to legal codes, religious texts, and administrative records. Most remarkable of all, many tablets were written not in Akkadian, the diplomatic language of the Near East, but in a previously unknown language that the scribes themselves called Nesili, the speech of the city of Nisa. The discovery created immediate excitement throughout the scholarly world. Here was tangible proof of a major Bronze Age power that had been completely unknown to modern scholarship. The sheer volume of written material suggested a level of bureaucratic sophistication comparable to Egypt or Mesopotamia. The international correspondence proved that this forgotten realm had been recognized as an equal by all the great powers of its age. Yet the most spectacular find was still to come. Among the thousands of tablets, Winkler discovered the complete text of the peace treaty between Ramses II and the Turkish king, written from the Turkish perspective. This treaty, the world's first known international peace agreement, revealed the names of the contracting parties and provided crucial information about the political structure of the forgotten realm. The Turkish king who had negotiated with Ramesses was called Hattusili III, ruler of the land of Hatti, clearly the same power mentioned in Egyptian sources and biblical texts. The task of deciphering the Turkish language found in these collections fell to Czech linguist Bedřich Hrozný. Working with the assumption that the unknown language belonged to the Indo-European family, a hypothesis based on certain recognizable words and grammatical structures, Hrozný began the painstaking process of linguistic reconstruction. His breakthrough came in 1915, when he successfully translated a passage about bread and water, proving that the language was indeed Indo-European and closely related to Latin, Greek, and other familiar European languages. This discovery was revolutionary, not just for understanding the forgotten realm, but for the entire field of Indo-European linguistics. Scholars had long theorized about the original homeland of the Indo-European language family, but had little concrete evidence about its earliest written forms. The Turkish tablets provided that evidence, preserving the oldest written Indo-European language by several centuries, and offering crucial insights into the development of the entire language family. Hrosnay's decipherment work revealed that the realm had called itself Hatti, and its people the same name preserved in biblical texts, though referring to a far grander power than anyone had previously imagined. The document collections contain detailed records of campaigns, diplomatic negotiations, legal proceedings, and religious ceremonies that brought this vanished world back to life with extraordinary vividness. The legal codes discovered in the collections proved particularly significant for understanding development of law. The codes addressed everything from property rights and commercial transactions to marriage, divorce, and criminal justice. Unlike the harsh, retributive justice found in some contemporary legal systems, Turkish law emphasized compensation and restoration, treating even serious crimes as matters that could be resolved through appropriate payments to injured parties. Religious texts provided insights into a complex theological system that had successfully integrated diverse traditions from across the realm. The pantheon included hundreds of deities, from the supreme storm god to local protective spirits, all organized into a hierarchical system that reflected the political structure of the state itself. Detailed festival calendars revealed the enormous resources devoted to religious ceremonies that reinforced both divine favor and political unity. International correspondence preserved in the collections illuminated the sophisticated diplomatic culture of the Late Bronze Age. Letters between Turkish kings and their Egyptian, Mesopotamian, and Levantine counterparts revealed a world of great power politics, conducted through carefully negotiated treaties, royal marriages, and commercial agreements. The tone of this correspondence, with foreign rulers addressing each other as brother and discussing matters of mutual concern, demonstrated a level of international cooperation that would not be seen again until much later periods. Administrative records provided extraordinary detail about the practical operation of a Bronze Age state. Tax assessments, rosters, and inventory lists revealed how the central government managed resources across vast territories inhabited by diverse populations. The bureaucratic sophistication evident in these documents demonstrated that Bronze Age states could achieve levels of administrative complexity comparable to much later imperial systems. Perhaps most remarkably, the collections contained extensive records that allowed scholars to reconstruct the political chronology of the realm with unprecedented precision. Royal annals, campaign reports, and succession documents provided a detailed timeline of rulers and events that could be correlated with records from Egypt, Mesopotamia, and other contemporary powers. For the first time, the Turkish state could be placed in its proper context as one of the great powers of the Bronze Age world. As translation work progressed throughout the 20th century, the scope of the rediscovered power became increasingly clear. Archaeological excavations at sites across Turkey and Syria revealed the extent of Turkish cultural influence. From the Aegean coast to the Euphrates River, distinctive architectural styles, artistic motifs, and religious symbols testified to the reach of the vanished state. The capital at Hattusa proved to be only one of several major urban centers. Excavations at sites like Alakahoyuk, Kultepe, and Yazılıkaya revealed sophisticated settlements with massive defensive walls, elaborate palace complexes, and impressive religious sanctuaries. The artistic achievements found at these sites, from intricately carved relief sculptures to delicate gold jewelry, demonstrated that the realm had supported cultural development on a scale comparable to its better-known contemporaries. Trade networks that had once connected the state to the broader world were reconstructed through careful analysis of imported goods found at Turkish sites. Luxury items from Egypt, Mesopotamia, Afghanistan, and even distant India testified to commercial relationships that had spanned the known world. The iron technology that had given Turkish armies their decisive advantages was revealed through metallurgical analysis of weapons and tools found in archaeological contexts. The religious sanctuary at Yazilikaya emerged as one of the most spectacular discoveries of the entire rediscovery process. This natural rock formation, located near Hattusa, had been carved with elaborate relief sculptures depicting the pantheon of Turkish deities. The largest chamber showed a procession of gods and goddesses meeting in divine assembly, while smaller chambers contained more intimate religious scenes. These carvings provided crucial insights into Turkish religious beliefs and demonstrated the sophisticated artistic capabilities of Bronze Age craftsmen. Sites throughout the former realm revealed the thinking that had enabled Turkish expansion and defense. Fortress cities positioned to control crucial mountain passes and river crossings showed how the state had projected power across difficult terrain. Weapons caches and defensive installations demonstrated the technological advantages that had made Turkish armies so effective against their Bronze Age opponents. The gradual piecing together of this forgotten power had profound implications for understanding the development of human society. The Turkish realm emerged as one of the crucial links connecting the Near East with early European development. Its role in spreading iron technology, Indo-European languages, and sophisticated political institutions helped explain patterns of cultural development that had previously seemed mysterious to scholars. The discovery also revolutionized understanding of the Bronze Age collapse that had ended so many societies around 1200 BC. The Turkish collections contain detailed records of the crisis period, including accounts of invasions by the mysterious Sea Peoples, economic disruption, and internal political breakdown. These records provided the most complete contemporary account of one of the world's most significant transition periods. Modern scholarship has continued to expand knowledge of the rediscovered realm through new archaeological discoveries and improved translation techniques. Ongoing excavations throughout Turkey continue to reveal new sites and artifacts that deepen understanding of Turkish culture. Advanced analytical techniques allow researchers to extract information about diet, climate, population levels, and technological development that earlier generations of scholars could never have accessed. The impact of the Turkish rediscovery extends far beyond academic circles. The revelation that one of the world's great powers had been completely forgotten and then restored to memory through archaeological science demonstrates the power of scholarly investigation to recover lost chapters of human experience. Museums throughout the world now display Turkish artifacts that allow modern audiences to appreciate the achievements of this remarkable society. The story of rediscovery also highlights the crucial importance of preserving archaeological sites and cultural heritage. The tablets and artifacts that enabled reconstruction of Turkish development survived only because they were buried and protected for thousands of years. Modern threats to archaeological sites, from development, looting, and conflict, endanger similar potential discoveries that might revolutionize our understanding of the past. Perhaps most significantly, the Turkish example demonstrates how much of human experience remains unknown and awaiting rediscovery. If a power as significant as the Turkish realm could vanish so completely from memory, how many other forgotten achievements lie buried beneath the archaeological record? The continuing expansion of archaeological investigation throughout the world suggests that many more such discoveries await future generations of scholars. The legacy of the Turkish realm thus lives on not just in the specific knowledge that has been recovered about their achievements, but in the inspiration their rediscovery provides for continuing archaeological investigation. Every excavation, every decipherment, every analytical breakthrough brings the possibility of uncovering new chapters in the human story that seemed permanently lost to time. The state that once challenged Egypt and pioneered innovations in diplomacy, law, and technology has found new life through the dedication of scholars who refuse to accept that any part of human achievement should remain forever buried. Their success in resurrecting this vanished power stands as testament to the power of human curiosity and the enduring value of our shared heritage. These people are no longer lost. Through the patient work of archaeologists, linguists, and historians, they have taken their rightful place among the great powers that shaped the world and contributed to the development of human society. Their story, from rise to fall to rediscovery, exemplifies both the fragility and the persistence of human achievement across the millennia. In recovering this lost realm, we have not just added another power to our knowledge. We have demonstrated that no human achievement is ever truly lost, as long as there are those willing to dig through the accumulated dust of centuries and piece together the fragments of forgotten greatness. The story of their rediscovery is ultimately a story about our own determination to understand and preserve the full richness of human experience across time. The age of rediscovery continues. Who knows what other forgotten states lie waiting beneath the earth, ready to expand our understanding of what our ancestors achieved and what we ourselves might accomplish.